listening to UMERADIO. This is the UMERADIO Morning Show. I'm DJ Kelly. And every morning we go through the news headlines just to give you a roundup of what is happening in the world today. And of course, UMERADIO, WUME-DB New York is our call sign. We broadcast from New York. And so it's only fitting that our front page that we're reading from is the New York Times. So today will be mostly sunny skies, cold, high 35. Tonight, clear, cold, low 26. And tomorrow, plenty of sunshine, not quite so cold in the afternoon, with a high 39. The weather map is on page C8. It's January 21. Now the photo that's on the front page is an interesting one. It's a group of men, white men. It look Caucasian men, and they look very militant. And the subtext below the photo says, thousands of armed demonstrators gathered near the Virginia state capitol in Richmond on Monday to protest gun control. Yeah, interestingly, they look militant and they have weapons, but they seem very peaceful as well. They don't seem aggressive in any way, hands in pockets, kind of thing. So it is, it's an interesting, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think this one is worth 10,000 words. Like, it says so much. They're peaceful, but you also get their statement. You know what I mean? So that's what we're seeing. So the story beneath that says, gun rights activists amass in a shifting state. Now under control of Democrats, Virginia is pursuing limits. This article is by Timothy Williams, Sabrina Tavernese, Zolan Kano-Youngs, and Sarah Mervosh. Some people streamed in on buses from faraway cities. Others drove cars through the night from places like Indianapolis and Fredericksburg, Texas, logging hundreds of miles and leaning on coffee and a Red Bull. Still, others came from only a few counties over, but carrying the same vehement message as the rest: leave gun laws alone. Thousands of people descended on Richmond, the capital of Virginia, on Monday to show support for the rights of gun owners as a push for gun control measures by that state's newly empowered Democrats has inserted Virginia into a nationwide debate over gun violence and the Second Amendment. And here is a quote: "I don't like what they're doing to our rights," said Raymond Pfaff, 85 years old, from Louisa County, Virginia, who wore a yellow sign around his neck that read, "First gun control and then people control." Another quote: "Guns protected this country for a couple of hundred years, and this two-faced governor just wants to take them," he said, referring to Governor Ralph Northam, a Democrat who has agreed to sign provisions banning guns in parks and limiting handgun purchases if Virginia lawmakers approve them. I'm a patriotic American," Mr. Pfaff said. "The left is going so far left right now." And that story continues on page A15. Interesting one there. Another headline, another story on the front page is an argument. It's a news analysis. An argument of no crime and no case. Defenders of president extend political cover. This story is by Charlie Savage out of Washington. As President Trump's impeachment trial opens, his lawyers have increasingly emphasized a striking argument. Even if he did abuse his powers in an attempt to bully Ukraine into interfering in the 2020 election on his behalf, it would not matter because the House never accused him of committing an ordinary crime. Their argument is widely disputed. It cuts against the consensus among scholars that impeachment exists to remove officials who abuse power. The phrase high crimes and misdemeanors means a serious violation of public trust that need not also be an ordinary crime, said Frank O. Bowman III, a University of Missouri law professor and the author of a recent book on the topic. Open quote, "This argument is constitutional nonsense," end quote, Mr. Bowman said. Open quote, "The almost universal consensus in Great Britain, in the colonies, in the American states between 1776 and 1787, at the Constitutional Convention and since, has been that criminal conduct is not required for impeachment," end quote. But the argument is politically convenient for Mr. Trump. For any moderate Republican senator who may not like what the facts already show about his campaign of pressure on Ukraine, the theory provides an alternative rationale to acquit the president. Indeed, if it were true, then there would also be no reason to call witnesses like John R. Bolton, Mr. Trump's former national security advisor, because what he and others know about Mr. Trump's motivations and intentions in his Ukraine dealings would not affect the outcome of the trial. Mr. Trump's legal team hammered away at the argument in its 110-page brief submitted to the Senate on Monday. House Democrats' newly invented abuse of power theory collapses at the threshold because it fails to allege any violation of law. And that story continues on page A12. In other news, McConnell plans for Senate trial on a speedy pace. 4 days of arguments. Democrats say limits on evidence amount to a cover-up. And this article is by Peter Baker, Maggie Haberman, and Nicholas Fandos. And it's again from Washington. Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, unveiled ground rules on Monday for President Trump's impeachment trial that would attempt to speed the proceeding along and refuse to admit the evidence against the president unearthed by the House without a separate vote. Mr. McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, showed his hand hours after Mr. Trump's legal team called on the Senate to swiftly reject the impeachment charges and acquit him, arguing that Democrats would permanently weaken the presidency if they succeeded in removing him from office over what the team characterized as policy and political differences. In a 110-page brief submitted to the Senate the day before Mr. Trump's trial begins in earnest, the president's lawyers advanced their first sustained legal argument since the House opened its inquiry in the fall, contending that the two charges, approved largely along party lines, were constitutionally flawed and set a dangerous precedent. Mr. Trump's lawyers dismissed the validity of both articles of impeachment lodged against him, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, because they do not state any specific violation of the law, advancing a constrained and widely rejected interpretation of the power to impeach a president. While the lawyers did not contest the basic facts of the case, they maintained that Democrats' accusations in effect seek to punish Mr. Trump for foreign policy decisions and efforts to preserve executive prerogatives. And here's a quote from the brief: "They do not remotely approach the constitutional threshold for removing a president from office." And that story continues on page A12. In other news, headlines. Criticism stifled in a Boeing crash. 2009 case has parallels to 737 MAX disasters, and this story is by Chris Hamby. After a Boeing 737 crashed near Amsterdam more than a decade ago, the Dutch investigators focused blame on the pilots for failing to react properly when an automated system malfunctioned and caused the plane to plummet into a field, killing 9 people. The fault was hardly the crew's alone, however. Decisions from Boeing, including risk design choices and faulty safety assessments, also contributed to the accident on the Turkish Airlines flight, but the Dutch Safety Board either excluded or played down criticisms of the manufacturer in its final report after pushback from a team of Americans that included Boeing and federal safety officials. Documents and interviews show. The crash in February 2009 involved a predecessor to Boeing's 737 MAX, the plane that was grounded last year after accidents in Indonesia and Ethiopia killed 346 people and hurled the company into the worst crisis in its history. A review by the New York Times of evidence from the 2009 accident, some of it previously confidential, reveals striking parallels with the recent crashes and resistance by the team of Americans to a full airing of findings that later proved relevant to the MAX. In the 2009 and MAX accidents, for example, the failure of a single sensor caused systems to misfire with catastrophic results, and Boeing had not provided pilots with information that could have helped them react to the malfunction. The earlier accident represents such a sentinel event that was never taken seriously, said Sidney Dekker, an aviation security expert who was commissioned by the Dutch Safety Board to analyze the crash. Dr. Dekker's study accused Boeing of trying to deflect attention from its own design shortcomings and other mistakes with hardly credible statements that admonished pilots to be more vigilant, according to a copy reviewed by the Times. That story continues on page A16. In other headlines, and there's another photo here on the front page, you can see it's like a group of people marching. Well, the subtext here says, linking arms for Dr. King. Democratic presidential hopefuls marched Monday in Colombia to honor a legacy. This story is on page A14. So you can see Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren together walking. They almost looked as though their hands are interlocked. I'm not sure. Oh yeah. All the persons' hands are interlocked as they march down the street. Yes, and of course the two Democratic presidential hopefuls are leading the pack. In other headlines, hard line on stop and frisk haunts Bloomberg. Apology may not sway crucial black voters. By Emma Fitzsimmons and Joseph Goldstein. Those are the writers. 2 months after jumping into the presidential race, Michael R. Bloomberg has hired staff members in 35 states. He has poured $200 million into advertising. He has crisscrossed the country, visiting dozens of cities far from the standard campaign trail. But one issue has dogged him the entire way: his use of stop and frisk policing as mayor of New York City, and his late apology for the tactic which targeted Black and Latino men. In the clearest sign yet of the threat that stop and frisk poses to his candidacy, Mr. Bloomberg traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma on Sunday to deliver an unusually personal speech that attempted to show a greater awareness about race after visiting a church with a largely black congregation. Mr. Bloomberg said at a nearby cultural center that being white probably helped propel his success and announced an economic plan to help black Americans. But in making those remarks, Mr. Bloomberg is inevitably drawing attention to his record on stop and frisk. Its crushing effect on many minority New Yorkers remains a vulnerability for him in the Democratic nomination race, where black voters are deeply influential. This story continues on page A14. In other headlines, in business, nature shows are hot again. As concern about climate change rises, streaming services are spending heavily on a rich supply of new content. I'm going to read that again. As concerns about climate change rises, streaming services are spending heavily on a rich supply of new content. And you know, we're in an age where content is king, they say. Okay, trade deals collateral damage. President Trump's China agreement gave tech gains, but bigger losses from the broader battle may be next. In international news, fear of pandemic rises. A prominent Chinese scientist says a mysterious respiratory illness that has killed at least 3 people can be transmitted by humans. Oh Lord. Loss, then a chance for love. A poet lost his sight and more to war in Afghanistan. His mother ensured he wouldn't lose his chance to wed. In national news, outrage over warehoused aid. Some cabinet members are fired after the discovery of unused aid for earthquake victims in Puerto Rico. And in sports, an uncertain road to Tokyo, the chance to get Tiger Woods was a big reason the Olympics reinstated golf. But will he even qualify? Acting her age and beyond, Coco Gauff is firmly established as a growing tennis force at 15, but she is still hooked on TikTok. And in New York, clogging the waterways, many abandoned and obsolete dams are blocking fish migration and harming rivers. A movement to remove the dams is growing. And finally, in art, Deadly Dad of Prodigal Son. How does Michael Sheen keep from bringing home all the weird energy of portraying a father who is a serial killer? Well, who said he did? And that is your news roundup from the Times this morning. We're going to go over to migration matters. You know, I like to share in the mornings trends in migration and issues that affect people who are migrants. Or this is what I usually say: travel. If you've traveled, or you have a desire to travel, or your family travels, then migration should matter to you, because we don't only have voluntary migration, we also have involuntary migration, where it wasn't planned or hoped for, but it was a result of a situation, of a travel experience, even in labor cases. You know, there's so many issues around the topic, and so many influences. So it is something that we should all care about, really. If you go to the UN News website, you'll see the images, of the remnants of the attack, burnt cars. There's a car at the front that's completely burnt, completely gone. Like, all you're seeing is the shell of the car and the effect of the fire. The building as well is burnt. Inside of the building is also burnt. Non-state armed groups targeted the humanitarian hub in Ngala, Borno State on Saturday evening, burning an entire section of the facility as well as a vehicle used in aid deliveries. 5 UN staff were staying there at the time but escaped unharmed due to security measures in place. Thank goodness for that. Thank God. Edward Callon, UN humanitarian coordinator in Nigeria, expressed outrage over the incident. I am shocked, he says, by the violence and intensity of this attack, which is the latest of too many incidents directly targeting humanitarian actors and the assistance we provide, he said on Monday. I am relieved all staff is now safe and secure. Aid workers, humanitarian facilities, and assets cannot be a target and must be protected and respected at all times. Northern Nigeria has been in the grip of Boko Haram insurgency for about a decade, which has led to widespread displacement. Last year, more than 10,000 people arrived in Ngala, searching for security and basic services, the UN Humanitarian Affairs Office, OCHA, reported. Disastrous effect on vulnerable. Mr. Callan said attacks against humanitarians have a disastrous effect on the vulnerable people they support. Many of them had already fled violence in their area of origin and were hoping to find safety and assistance in Ngala. This also jeopardizes the ability for aid workers to stay and deliver assistance to the people most in need in remote areas in Borno State, he said. Overall, the UN and partners are bringing vital assistance to more than 7 million people in 3 states affected by the crisis. Besides Borno, they also are operational in neighboring Adamawa and Yobe states. OCHA said aid workers in Nigeria are increasingly being targeted in attacks. 12 were killed last year, which is double the number killed in 2018. Meanwhile, the UN and its humanitarian partners continue to call for the safe release of 2 aid workers who remain in the hands of non-state armed groups after being abducted in separate incidents in Borno State. Grace Taku, a staff member with Action Against Hunger, was abducted alongside 5 male colleagues near Damasak in July 2019. The men were all killed, according to media reports. The other aid worker, Alice Loksha, a nurse and a mother, was kidnapped during an attack in Iran in March 2018. Let's pray for aid workers because they're needed and they're valued, and sometimes they put themselves in such risky situations trying to help the most vulnerable. In other global migration data, the world is witnessing the highest numbers of migrants on record, nearly 272 million in 2019, more than triple the number in 1970. And this information is coming from library.cqpress.com. Advocates of immigration restrictions say migrants steal jobs and sometimes abuse a system designed to provide asylum for the truly persecuted. But human rights advocates say nations are shirking their responsibility to provide refuge to those experiencing persecution and violence. Citing a broken system in which asylum seekers sometimes disappear into the United States, the Trump administration is limiting those who can seek asylum. It is also taking aggressive steps to end what President Trump calls a very serious crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. Migrant advocacy groups say Trump has manufactured a crisis, and statistics show illegal immigration from Mexico is in a long-term decline. Governments often seek to stem migration by providing aid to improve the economies of origin countries. Experts say the solution is not so simple because it takes at least a generation It takes at least a generation before rising income encourages people to remain at home. Here's an overview. Richie, a 25-year-old farmer from Honduras, and her 4-year-old son arrived at the United States border after a harrowing ordeal. A member of an indigenous group that has long faced discrimination and violence, Richie fled Honduras after her husband was murdered in December 2018, and she received death threats. But her troubles were only beginning. While she was in the border city of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico in March, a man tried to kidnap Richie's son, and she told U.S. asylum officers she feared it would happen again if she did not receive asylum in the United States. Her last name is being withheld to protect her privacy. The Trump administration, however, had just introduced its Remain in Mexico policy, requiring asylum seekers to stay in Mexico while their case is adjudicated. An American soldier helps fortify the U.S. border. This is a photo that they're showing where an American soldier helps fortify the U.S.-Mexico border in San Diego in 2018. President Trump has called illegal border crossings a very serious crisis, but immigration advocates say the administration's policy are partly responsible for the problem. You get the images. I like to credit those who do the work, So Richie, continuing the story, Richie says she was sent back to Juarez, considered one of the most dangerous cities in the world, to await a decision in her asylum case, a wait that would last 5 months. Under U.S. and international law, refugees have a right not to be returned to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened, but Richie says it was not until her third interview that she was allowed to enter the United States. Then Homeland Security Kirsten Nielsen said the administration introduced the policy because migrants were trying to, quote unquote, game the system and disappearing into the United States. Discouraging this, quote unquote, catch and release practice would reduce incentives for illegal immigrants, Nielsen said in announcing the policy in late 2018. Rich's story illustrates a political divide over immigration that is playing out across the globe. On one side, President Trump and populist politicians in Europe say immigrants are overrunning their countries, changing the culture and abusing laws aimed at providing asylum for the truly persecuted. On the other side, human rights advocates say governments are shirking their obligation under international treaties to provide refuge for those fleeing persecution or violence. Inherent in this debate is the anxiety expressed by workers and politicians that migrants depress wages and steal jobs. And here's a quote: "They're taking our jobs. They're taking our manufacturing jobs. They're taking our money. They're killing us." Trump, speaking of undocumented Mexican immigrants, said at a Phoenix rally during his presidential campaign. At the same time, many experts say migrants are needed to fill labor shortages in aging populations in Europe and Asia. By 2050, fewer than half of Europeans over 18 will be working, down from about 2/3 now, because Europe's population is graying, according to Michael Clemens, Director of Migration at the Center for Global Development, a Washington, D.C. think tank. That's a drastic shift, he says. The world is witnessing the highest numbers of migrants on record, nearly 272 million in 2019, more than triple the number in 1970. However, the share of migrants as a percentage of world population remains small at 3.5%. And here's another quote: "The population of foreign-born people living outside the country of their birth is still at the same level it's been historically, a share that has generally ranged from 2 to 3% since 1890, says Justin Jest, assistant professor of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University and co-author of a 2018 book analyzing how 30 countries regulate immigration. Another quote, "That's why it's not really a crisis. The crisis is in governance," he says, pointing to the failure of Europe and other nations to deal with the more than 6 million refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war that began in 2011. Michael Doyle, a political scientist at Columbia University, agrees the global response has been inadequate. Another quote, "Migrants have not been vilified in these ways since the 1920s, he says. The refugee system is failing to respond to the needs of millions." The global migrant population includes 1. Asylum seekers, those who have traveled to another country seeking protection from persecution, but whose cases have yet to be adjudicated. And number 2, refugees, those who have met the requirements for protection under international law, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which identifies, screens, and in some cases resettles refugees with partner governments to provide protection. And third, other migrants, those who change their country of permanent residence, although there is no accepted definition of migration in international law. Capturing most of the headlines are refugees fleeing violence, war, or persecution. 70.8 million, according to the United Nations, the highest number since it began tracking refugee movements after World War II. Most refugees have been internally displaced within their own countries, some 41.3 million, while another 20.4 million, not counting Palestinian refugees, have crossed borders, according to the UN. And here is a diagram showing most refugees stay in their home countries. The largest group of refugees, 41.3 million, remain within their own countries and are classified by the United Nations as internally displaced. Nearly 30 million others seek protection or asylum elsewhere. Man, let's pray for people who, let's pray for migrants, think about them. Whatever the reasons, whatever the cause, they need our support, they need our love, they need our prayers, Yeah. And in our business trends report, today I'm going to be sharing some information with you from LinkedIn Talent Solutions, ensuring happy new hires. Employee recruiting is one of the most challenging and one of the most expensive processes that companies go through, especially entrepreneurs and especially small to medium-sized businesses. Recruiting and retention can be such a challenge, and so it's important to get information or training on how to onboard employees for longevity and for retention. You know what I mean? So I found this research that LinkedIn did to be quite useful, and so I want to share some more with you. I've started sharing it before, and I'm going to continue. So the title is the Complete Guide to Onboarding New Hires, a 45-day checklist to take you from pre-arrival through the first month and beyond, ensuring happy new hires. When a new hire joins your company, the first few months set the tone. If things go smoothly, the process can improve their long-term satisfaction, job performance, and retention. As a manager, you play a critical role in the success of every new hire. The checklist and tips in this guide will help you build an effective, scalable onboarding program. And there are 6 phases on the checklist. Here, let me just share this data with you. 1 in 5 new hires leave within the first 45 days of starting a job. That can be costly. Well, it is costly, and I'm an entrepreneur, so I know it's one of the most difficult things. As a matter of fact, I don't even like to think. When I think about employees or hiring people, like it's so discombobulating for me. It's such a I terrify the process. You know, so yes, so it is costly, but you can avoid it by putting the right process in place. In fact, after a strong onboarding process, employees are 2.8 times more likely to say they have the best job, and 58%, that's a big number, 58% more likely to stay for 3 or more years. That is interesting, is important. You know, a well-structured onboarding program will get your new employees off to a good start. It helps set expectations and define your culture while helping people feel like they belong. You know what it is when you meet someone new, you want to go through the process of introduction, you know, where this is who I am, this is who you are, these are the things I like, these are the things I don't like. You get to know each other, you develop rapport. Right? So for your business, the same thing is required. You need to build rapport and build the rapport of your team. For your team, and you have to take them through that change process, because what happens is when someone new comes on board, change is happening. So you have to guide your newcomer through the process, as well as those who are your current employees. You have to also take them through the process as well, you know, so the right introductions are important. So there are 6 phases of successful onboarding. Phase 1, pre-arrival. Phase 2, first day. Phase 3, second day. Phase 4, first week. Phase 5, first month. Phase 6, month 2 and beyond. And we've already shared phases 1 and 2, so now we're going to talk about phase 3. Right, so let's get to it. So phase 3 is second day. It is time to help your new hire get to know you as a manager. Block off time to speak with them on a one-on-one basis, detailing your management style and expectations. Answer any questions they may have. You can also use this time to discuss their duties and review their training schedule. 96% of employees say one-on-one time with their direct manager is useful during their onboarding experience. Okay, so here is the phase 3 or second day checklist. Job overview. Provide insight into their day-to-day job requirements. Clarify the schedule for the week and confirm required training. And review job description, duties, and expectations. What will the new hire be doing? What are the specific responsibilities? What are your goals for the new hire? What are their goals and expectations? What's expected in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Have you ever been to a new job, and nobody really tells you what you're supposed to do, where you have this job description and you're busy going about your business trying to do these things, not realizing you're stepping on people's toes? This happened to me, you know, and you can't understand why you're getting pushback sometimes, or why you're not feeling supported. When I remember for me, once I had this experience where I was working in a job where I became the communications and public relations officer. And the director that I reported to, it was first I concluded it. I made a judgment call, and then she had the conversation with me. I filled a position that she loved. And so even though she was promoted and she accepted the promotion because that promotion increased her salary, even though she was now the director, she still coveted the position where I was based on what she loved to do. So when I would be busy carrying out my task, the person who I believe was supposed to be supporting me was the person giving me the pushback. And sometimes she would give me these faces, and there was just this tension sometimes. And even the office recognized it, because like I would be getting the board members when they come for meetings, or the directors would sometimes say, you know, it's gonna be okay, don't worry. And sometimes they'd be telling me things like, they'd be showing me special attention and like giving me special care, and I didn't understand. But then I later realized that there were conversations that were being had that I was not privy to, you know, because I was doing my job well. It was being an issue for somebody, the person who was set to lead me and to support me as the director, you know, the director that I report to. So those things happen, and it's important to have the conversation. Let the person know these are the things that you should be doing, your specific responsibilities, and things like that. It's more than just giving them a job description. You know what I mean? They need to know the day-to-day and the expectations. And the next thing is the next thing is manager overview. Define your personal management style. How can you best work together? What are your preferences and expectations? Review internal processes and workflow. Explain annual performance review and goal setting. Leave plenty of time for questions. And that is the end of our news headlines, migration and business trends roundup. You are listening to UMERADIO.